So what was the response of the Jewish community in Palestine? The Yeshuv, as it was called. The rebellion led to the expansion of the Jewish self-defense force, known as the Haganah. The expansion of the Jewish self-defense force was conducted with British permission. The British, after all, were very pleased to have more Jewish military force that would allow them cooperation in the suppression of the Arab rebellion. So Jewish auxiliary forces were established with British permission and sometimes even under British command, such as the field companies or the special night squads that were established by the British officer Ord Wingate and enhanced the Jewish military potential quite significantly. The Jewish forces in Palestine, as a result of the Arab rebellion, began to assume a more regular army style, more than an underground organization. And it was in the 1930s that the Jewish military force also developed its intelligence capabilities and generally enhanced its military potential. No Jewish settlements were abandoned during the Arab rebellion. In fact, many more were built. And the building of settlements was continued with the idea of partition in mind. That is, the building of settlement in blocks that would allow eventually for the partition of Palestine into two states. The fact that a port was built in Tel Aviv was an indication of the developing transport capabilities of the Jewish settlement in Palestine. And generally, the Yeshuv became more autonomous in just about every respect. Jews and Arabs became more physically separate. Two separate communities living apart is the way things were developing in Palestine. And the rebellion had its limits and much of a boomerang effect of the strike, for example, on the Arab community. The Arabs were weakened by the strike, economically and socially, as they were also, and even more so, by the general internal divisions, and as a result, it is they who arrived exhausted to the struggle in 1948. Arab society in Palestine was deeply divided and leaderless, and there were divisions on many levels between factions, village and town, Muslims and Christians, notables and peasants, and one can go on and on. The rebellion, as we have noted, lasted for 3 years, from 1936 to 1939. Shortly after the rebellion broke out, the British, as they usually did in circumstances such as these, appointed a commission of inquiry. And that commission of inquiry, known as the Peel Commission, since it was headed by Lord Peel, investigated the situation in Palestine and published a most impressive report, one of the most impressive pieces of scholarship, one could say, on the problem of Palestine ever written. And the Peel report recognized that the rebellion proved that in Palestine there were two national movements. This was a radical departure from the British policy of the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration, after all, had only recognized Jewish national rights. Here one can point to the change that was effected by the Arab rebellion. The Arab rebellion had many failures to which we have already alluded. But the Arab rebellion also had a number of important successes. And that was to convince the British and the Zionists that there was indeed an Arab national movement in Palestine that could not be ignored. This drove the British to the logic of partition. If there were two national movements in Palestine, it made sense to create two states in Palestine, to divide Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. And when the report was published in July 1937, it indeed signified partition as the solution to the Palestine question. The Jews were given a state that included the coastal plain and the Galilee, some 20% of the territory of Palestine, and the rest was given to the Arabs of Palestine. Jerusalem was not included in either the Jewish state or the Arab state, but was to be included in an area that would still be run by the British mandate. The Arab state that was to be created in Palestine would not be independent, but would be annexed to the state of Transjordan. and thus Transjordan would become a big Arab state that would encompass both sides of the Jordan River. Since there was a large Arab population within the boundaries of this Jewish state, particularly in the Galilee, the Peel report came up with the idea of transferring the Arabs of the Galilee, some voluntarily and others by coercion, to the Arab state. Arab opposition to the Peel report was complete, with one exception. The Emir Abdullah of Transjordan, who was to, of course, acquire the Arab part of Palestine, came out in support of the program, but no other Arabs did. As for the Jews, they rather grudgingly accepted the British decision to give them some 20% of Palestine, which on the one hand was a historical recognition of the idea of Jewish statehood, but in only 20% of Palestine, many on the Jewish side favored rejection. But in the end, the majority of the Jews went along with the partition idea, most of them believing that this would be a basis for further discussion with the British when the time came. The expansion of the borders might come later. But the British withdrew the idea in 1938. The winds of war were blowing in Europe, and there was a need to placate the Arabs. The Arabs were a much more useful ally for the British than the Jews, who only had their problems to offer. In early 1939, with no agreement in sight between the Jews and the Arabs in Palestine, and as the Arab rebellion was grinding to an end, the British convened a conference in London at the Palace of St. James, and therefore known as the St. James Conference, in which the Jews and the Arabs deliberated for weeks on end with no conclusion, at the end of which the British issued a white paper of their own, that is, a British statement of policy. And essentially, this British statement of policy from May 1939, the white paper of May 1939, was the final British abandonment of support for the Zionist idea. The white paper included three main points. One was that Jewish immigration to Palestine would be restricted to 75,000 in the 5 years ahead, 15,000 a year. Jewish immigration would only be able to continue thereafter, that is from 1944 onwards, with Arab consent. But Arab consent for Jewish immigration would mean, in fact, that there would be no more Jewish immigration to Palestine. Land sales were also restricted to those areas where the Jews were already predominant, and Palestine was to become independent in 10 years' time. What that meant was that if Jewish immigration would only continue at 15,000 a year until 1944, and Palestine would become independent in 1949, Palestine would be an independent Arab state in which the Jews would only be a minority. That meant, in practice, the end of the Zionist idea. This independent state in 10 years' time was possibly to be part of a greater Arab federation, so the British thought, and there would therefore be neither a Jewish state nor an Arab state, but Palestine would be part of a greater Arab federation. But in such a greater Arab state, the Jewish minority would be even more inconsequential. The timing of the white paper in May 1939 was particularly unfortunate. The Jewish plight in Europe was worsening from day to day. And as a result, the white paper was widely condemned by the opposition in Britain and was even rejected by the League of Nations as the lack of British fulfillment of their mandate over Palestine. Britain's argument, on the other hand, was that the national home already existed. They had fulfilled their commitment completely. There were 500,000 Jews in Palestine. There were many Jewish settlements, a vibrant Jewish community with its political institutions and organizations. The British, so they argued, had honestly fulfilled their commitment. For the Zionists, this was a huge disappointment. This was an abandonment by the British of the Zionist enterprise. And the Arab rebellion in Palestine also presented the Zionists with the realization that what they had ahead of them was a conflict between ideology and reality. The project, as they had hoped, was not one of peace, but conflict. Armed conflict with the Arabs was inevitable eventually. And as a result of that realization, there were some on the Zionist side who questioned the very right of the Zionists to settle in Palestine and to continue with the project if this is what it entailed. There were those who thought that the idea of Jewish statehood should be abandoned. But for the majority of the Zionists, that was not the conclusion. And their idea was to prepare for the fight that was certainly to come. There was no choice but to face this reality, and it was the youth born in Palestine who would have to follow and execute the policy of confrontation. Active defense was the homeland style of Jewish defense and self-help, as opposed to the Jews of the diaspora, who were more helpless in their confrontation with their enemies of the exile. The White Paper and its abandonment of the Zionist project meant that cooperation with Britain was no longer possible. And therefore, the Zionist project as one of evolution, of graduality, made no sense anymore. There was no time for that. Time was running out. The predicament of the Jews in Europe was only getting worse, and British support had come to an end. It was no longer an evolutionary process that would be satisfactory, but a revolutionary process. And a revolutionary process meant that eventually there would have to be an armed confrontation with the Arabs in Palestine and perhaps the neighboring Arabs too. But war was not to be initiated. War was only to happen when all other options had been exhausted and when it was imposed by the other side. The Jews, therefore, at the end of the Arab rebellion, had to prepare for partition and for possible war. Partition would not bring peace, they knew, and therefore, despite the fact that they were willing to concede on territory, they realized that this would entail confrontation anyway.